Here's 6 things the Miami Grand Prix revealed about F1 2026. Mercedes won this race the hard way, losing track position, then outdoing McLaren with better execution to steal it back. Although the two teams inevitably claimed the other was slightly faster, Mercedes and McLaren were close enough that it didn't matter which of them really had a tenth or two in hand. McLaren's big upgrade package and Mercedes only bringing minor new parts addressed a large chunk of the car deficit last year's world champion had to its engine supplier. This turned it from opportunistic pretender to out-and-out contender, hence Lando Norris winning Saturday's sprint race from pole, helped by Mercedes not optimising its energy deployment until the middle of the weekend. He could, and probably should, have completed the double in the Grand Prix. What made the difference was how the two teams handled the crucial pit stop phase. With the threat of rain looming but never quite materialising, Mercedes decided to pull the pin on an earlier stop as soon as it could be reasonably confident that intermediate tyres wouldn't be needed. The gap to Norris had stabilised at around 2 seconds, and a pass on track in a steady state race to the finish seemed unlikely. Knowing the value of the undercut, Mercedes brought Kimi Antonelli in as soon as it looked like even an immediate response from McLaren would be too late. Mercedes' timing was right, and so was its 2.2 second pit stop. Antonelli aced his in-lap and his out-lap. Norris pitted the lap immediately after, and although Norris emerged from the actual pit exit ahead, Antonelli was able to pass on the run to turn 4. He was also swift at clearing Max Verstappen's Red Bull, and, with track position secured, was able to keep Norris more or less at arm's length for the rest of the race, despite a couple of stressful moments with troublesome downshifts. McLaren is adamant Mercedes still has a couple of tenths of a second advantage, but it was beatable in Miami. What's now to be determined is whether Mercedes' own upgrades will move it clear again, or if it's going to face this kind of stern challenge elsewhere. Charles Leclerc led the first part of this race after a brilliant start and a well-judged first corner, succouring Antonelli and Max Verstappen into big lockups, and by the end of lap 16 he was still within a second of eventual winner Antonelli. Leclerc had given chase to the McLarens in the sprint race, and the heavily upgraded Ferrari seemed better on its tyres too. All looked quite well. Yet Leclerc drifted to more than 20 seconds behind Antonelli and Norris by the end of the Grand Prix. Well, by the final lap, when he spun and slapped the wall hard. That wrecked any hopes he had of reclaiming the final podium spot from Oscar Piastri, and it ultimately left Leclerc down in 8th as he slipped to 6th on the road, then copped a 20-second penalty for repeatedly cutting corners while trying to wrestle his damaged car to the finish. But the big prize had long since eluded him, given Ferrari's surprising lack of race pace. Leclerc said he had massive degradation on the medium tyre, and that even on the hard compound he never felt as comfortable as he had during the sprint. The fact this happened despite Ferrari bringing a lot of developments to what already looked like a really solid car is a bit of a blow. Ferrari had the largest upgrade of the top teams in Miami, at least in terms of number of items declared to the FIA, with changes front to back. Leclerc was adamant this upgrade worked though, which suggests Ferrari must search for another reason why it struggled. And though Leclerc doesn't feel there's a pattern of Ferrari drifting away in races, it still hasn't been able to sustain a challenge after any of its bright starts, a disappointing trend that continued in Miami. For the first time this season, Red Bull had a car capable of getting a better result than either of its drivers delivered. The RB22 was midfield fodder in China and Japan, which is where Max Verstappen and Ishaq Hadjar ran, but a big suite of upgrades transformed things in Miami. Red Bull's weekend just got better and better as it halved its deficit from the early races in sprint qualifying, then had Mercedes challenging pace in Saturday's race before Verstappen qualified on the front row for the Grand Prix, less than 2 tenths off pole position. Verstappen said you'd have been completely crazy to predict that after Japan, where he and Hadjar decried how unpredictable, slow and tough to drive the Red Bull was. It's a shame then that Verstappen never gave himself the chance to show what kind of weapon the revised RB22 could be in the Grand Prix. Looping it through 360 degrees at turn 2 while fighting Leclerc after being mugged by him into the first corner after the start dropped Verstappen into the pack, and he was perhaps fortunate to avoid trouble with some aggressive overtaking as he tried to recover lost ground. Red Bull tried something different on strategy, pitting under a very early safety car, but that committed him to doing 51 laps on hard tyres he preferred much less than the mediums. It never looked like being a route to the podium, although he salvaged 5th place on the run to the finish after Leclerc hit trouble. Verstappen was lucky Leclerc got his penalty, otherwise he would have dropped back to 6th thanks to a 5-second penalty of his own for crossing the white line exiting the pits. It was a messy race, but at least better than Hadjar's. Hadjar was disqualified from qualifying for a Red Bull floor infringement, which seemed to boil down to an installation issue, and his recovery from the pit lane lasted just 4.5 laps before a careless wall strike put him out on the spot. The second driver struggling on a weekend Verstappen took a massively upgraded Red Bull to new heights felt like a worryingly familiar narrative. It's not a new thing to see Alpine leading the way in F1's midfield in 2026, but the manner with which it did so in Miami was markedly different to what we've seen so far. The big step forward taken by the top teams meant there was a slightly lower bottom of the top 10 ceiling placed on Alpine's potential here compared to places like China and Japan, where Pierre Gasly comfortably outqualified Red Bulls. But those marginal battles to progress out of Q2 were no longer marginal at all, as the heavily upgraded Alpine, featuring a revised nose, brake drums and suspension fairings, as well as an all-new rear wing, pulled 3 to 4 tenths clear of the likes of Audi and Haas. Partly that was down to those more potent recent midfield rivals bringing much less to the table in terms of upgrades, but the fact both Alpines were properly competitive is even more telling. Franco Colapinto made Q3 for the first time this season and finished comfortably the highest placed midfield runner. He was 8th across the line before Leclerc's penalty promoted him to 7th, more than 20 seconds clear of the next best midfield car, Carlos Sainz's heavily updated Williams, and within 8.2 seconds of Lewis Hamilton's Ferrari. No wonder Colapinto called this his best weekend since entering F1. Overall delight at Alpine will be slightly tempered by Gasly ending his unbroken run of points finishes this year with an upside down smack into the barriers on a weekend where he was subdued by what he reckoned was a persistent problem with drivability and wheel spin on his car in particular. But even so, he was right there with Colapinto on pure pace, further supporting the idea the car has made a genuine step forward, while others in the midfield are now getting swallowed up by the much improved and heavily dieting Williams. This season is meant to be George Russell's big shot at a first world title, but is he already in serious danger of blowing it? There's obviously still a very long way to go, but nothing about how things have played out so far has been particularly smooth on his side, whether it's been getting bogged down on race starts and safety car restarts, dicing with the Ferraris, or being a step behind his teammate Antonelli, as was the case throughout the Miami weekend. Considering how rightly highly rated Russell is and his vastly greater F1 experience, there's no way he should be trailing a 19-year-old by 20 points after 4 events in what has clearly been the best car on the grid. And there's a danger for Russell that the momentum and confidence just builds in Antonelli now he's won 3 Grand Prix on the bounce, the third of which was described by Mercedes team boss Toto Wolff as Antonelli's best race so far in F1, just as Russell endured what he called a very tough race in which he was so lost in terms of how to drive the car that he was using the final 20 laps as an experiment in his search for greater pace. Russell admits Antonelli is in a good place at the moment and momentum is with him. But Russell is trying to ignore the bigger picture for now and simply focusing on returning to the top step of the podium. It's also true to say that had the safety car timing fallen better for him in Japan, Russell would be looking at 2 wins from 4 races and a slender championship advantage over Antonelli, so it's very much a fine margin situation. There's something about the smooth Miami track surface that upsets Russell's natural equilibrium and appears to play to Antonelli's strengths. Russell admits he prefers higher grip situations, a bit like what we see with Oscar Piastri versus Lando Norris at McLaren. This is why Russell says he can't wait for upcoming races in more ordinary conditions, by which he means rougher tracks and less heat. The next race in Canada will be a huge test because it's where Russell took the first of his 2 wins in 2025 and will also be where Mercedes introduces its first major car upgrade of 2026. If Antonelli is on top of Russell in Montreal, then George really will have cause for concern. Mercedes team boss Wolff said anyone who complained about the Miami Grand Prix racing spectacle should hide because in his view it would be such an outrageous position to hold. But that doesn't mean the rule changes made ahead of this weekend are now vindicated and F1 2026 has suddenly reached perfection. The energy-rich nature of the Miami circuit, its stop-start layout means there are plentiful opportunities to recharge the battery under conventional braking, means this was always likely to be one of the better showcases for the new regulations, regardless of the more restrictive energy regeneration and deployment limits imposed since F1 banged heads together during the surprise April gap. It was clear the cars were being driven more normally in Miami, with hardly any extreme lifting and coasting or so-called super clipping, where the MGU-K runs in reverse to charge the battery under full throttle. But the underlying problems remain. Power units that rely on a near 50-50 split of combustion and electrical power simply cannot propel these F1 cars around current F1 circuits efficiently enough. Max Verstappen, perhaps the most vocal critic of 2026 so far, was clearly happier to be driving a more competitive Red Bull in Miami, but he hasn't changed his view on the rules. Carlos Sainz is another who's been forthright in criticising these regulations publicly. He felt things were a bit better in Miami. But a bigger test will come at the next race in Canada, which, along with places like Monza, Las Vegas and Austria's Red Bull Ring, is very much in the camp of energy-poor F1 circuits.